Since the beginning of time, leaders have always emerged from the masses, and a few have risen to such prominence that long after their departure from the battlefield of life, their memory has been preserved down through the ages for each new generation to discover. One of the most famous among these heroes of history is Napoleon, who is to this day still known the whole world over. And whether his name is uttered with reverence due to the great man's undoubted military genius, or suggestively with an attempt at a French accent, the image of a diminutive, rather rotund figure in a sweeping gray coat and fancy hat will most probably spring to mind. Yet, finding the man behind the myth is a more difficult task altogether. Many thousands of books have been written on the subject of Napoleon, but as is so often the case with historical icons, opinion varies considerably. On the one hand, Napoleon is considered a true-hearted and patriotic revolutionary, with a tantalizingly tactical brain, exceptional leadership qualities, a mastery of combat skills, abilities to organize and finance better than any government administrator, and a natural affinity for military strategy that was, quite literally, beyond compare. On the other hand, some quite justifiably brand Napoleon a bully and a tyrant, a man who possessed a ruthless and cynical desire for power and violence, along with an inflated ego that colored his judgment and persuaded him that he could do no wrong. A list of traits that seemed to characterize just about every military dictator, before Napoleon, or for that matter, since. Either way, there is no denying that Napoleon Bonaparte was, and still is, a giant figure in the history books. And for those of you who know a little about him, and are willing to challenge the usage of the word giant, then drop anchor at once. For Napoleon was not a short man, as history would have us believe. When he died, the official measurement of his height was 5 foot 2 inches. But this was taken in French measurements. On the imperial scale, widely used today throughout the world, that measurement actually comes out as 5 foot 7 inches. So rather than being short, Napoleon actually stood taller than the average Frenchman of his day. Another reason why Napoleon is often perceived as a vertically challenged leader is due to a nickname given to him, Le Petit Caporal. Anyone with a smattering of the French language will tell you that petit means little. But in the intended context, this was in fact an affectionate term, reflecting Napoleon's camaraderie with his ordinary foot soldiers and his lack of pretensions with his fighting men. Not any lack in physical stature. Regardless of which version of Napoleon is to be believed, evil dictator or inspiring military leader, or as is most often the case somewhere between the two extremes, we'll look at his truly fascinating and eventful life, following his progress from the wildly beautiful island of Corsica to his coronation as the Emperor of France and final defeat at the Battle of Waterloo. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, something that our subject was very good at. Napoleon was evidently so eager to get into this world and start living it his way that his mother, Letizia, gave birth to him immediately after returning from Mass on a downstairs sofa before she could even reach her bed. This auspicious day was the 15th of August in the year 1769. Napoleon Bonaparte was born in the town of Ajaccio, on the island of Corsica, which is located west of Italy, southeast of France, and north of the island of Sardinia. It's the fourth largest island in the Mediterranean Sea, and in the year of Napoleon's birth it was taken over by France and claimed as a French region. Originally, it had been ruled by the city of Genoa in Italy. Letizia was only 19 years old when she gave birth to Napoleon, and he was her second son. She went on to bear a total of 13 children, of whom only 8 would survive to adulthood. She had married Carlos Bonaparte when she was a mere 14 years of age, 5 years before Napoleon's birth. Carlos came from a family of minor nobility and was an attorney by trade. He was also the representative for Corsica in the court of King Louis XVI of France. Of Napoleon's parents, Letizia was certainly the dominant influence, with Carlos away for long stretches of time with his duties to the court of King Louis XVI and his studies at the Corsican University. Letizia, despite her youth, was a strong-willed woman who was very strict with her children. When Corsica was taken over by France, the French language was installed as a prerequisite for all the inhabitants. But Letizia never spoke a word of French throughout her long life, and she brought up her children the same way. Because of this, Napoleon himself never fully mastered the language and spoke French with a heavy Italian accent, pronouncing certain words as if they obeyed Italian rules of phonetics. Letizia was also obsessed with cleanliness and bathed her children every day. By today's standards, this is perfectly normal, but in the 18th century, even the upper classes only consented to a bath once every month, and sometimes not even that. Because of his well-connected and moderately noble family status, Napoleon was afforded easier access and greater opportunities to study when he came of age than other Corsican children. So, at a very young age, he set foot on French soil, entering a military academy at Brienne-le-Château. The academy had been a monastery a mere 3 years earlier, teaching religion. Its military teachings were hardly of the highest standards, as it was a school that was still run by monks who adhered to their long-established religious ethos. The purpose of the academy was to prepare the sons of the nobility for eventual cadetship in the armed forces. A cadet was the term for an officer in training. But the education provided was more akin to instilling an 18th century gentleman with manners and etiquette, rather than with the more practical skills needed for leading soldiers into battle. However, Napoleon spoke fondly of his time there, which is probably due to the fact that the school was neither strict nor particularly competent, coming across in the reports of frequent official inspections as a cross between a prison, a circus, and a holiday camp. The official reports varied from those stating the teachers and the students were merely lazy and careless, to the most damning such report in 1787, which recorded outright indiscipline as its verdict. Even the religion was poorly taught, and legend has it that the Berton brothers, who ran the academy as principal and vice principal, would efficiently execute morning mass in 10 minutes flat. Much later in life, the principal, Louis Berton, was saved from poverty by Napoleon, who gifted him a job in educational administration. Such acts of kindness by Napoleon were not infrequent, and are often overlooked when he is painted as a tyrannical dictator. Napoleon was a complex, complicated man, whose personality changed during his life, something that those close to him had to quickly get accustomed to. Napoleon's education was erratic, but yet erudite. He read voraciously, mainly concentrating on ancient military history. He had a particular fascination with great military leaders, and one in particular, Julius Caesar. Caesar was not only a military leader, but also a political one. He was instrumental in transforming the Roman Republic into the Roman Empire, with his constant invasions and dominations of nations and cultures. It was his power and influence that eventually led to his downfall, thought mainly to be because of his extensive reforms to Roman society and government. His best friend Marcus Brutus conspired with some of his detractors to assassinate him and reclaim Rome as a republic again. When Caesar was assassinated, a civil war ensued which ended with a resounding victory for Octavian, the adopted son and great-nephew of the murdered Julius Caesar, who became known as the Emperor Caesar Augustus. Napoleon was taught about the assassination from the viewpoint that Julius Caesar was a tyrant, and that his best friend Brutus was the champion of liberty and freedom. His own contrary conclusion was that Caesar was a great and powerful leader, and that his best friend had betrayed him. Perhaps from this first foray into history, Napoleon became inspired to emulate Julius Caesar. There is certainly a strong parallel between the mighty conquering Roman and the ever-advancing Napoleon Bonaparte. As well as this penchant for ancient history, Napoleon also displayed a great gift for mathematics and was seen as the star pupil of his academy. Every year, the school opened its doors to the public and the students were put to the test by their teachers, showing off what they had learned to all who attended. Napoleon was always the star turn and never failed to impress his audience. However, although his academic progress was good, his social progress was sadly lacking. From a young age, Napoleon was forced to feel inferior to his fellow pupils because of his Corsican background. But his pride refused to allow this, and he kept to himself rather than try and fit in with the crowd. Bullying is no modern problem. Napoleon was physically and mentally taunted for his sallow skin and nationality, with his name being changed to Pale au Nez, meaning straw nose. It was an insult he still remembered and even referred to at the end of his life. His Corsican nationalism was scoffed at as well, with jibes about Corsicans being a defeated race of people who were natural cowards. Again, this may actually have been a spur to motivate Napoleon, as he always stated that Corsicans were brave people who had been outnumbered 10 to 1 when France took over their country, and he vowed that he would lead Corsica to independence again when he was older. When he graduated from Brienne in 1784, the young Napoleon was instantly admitted into the École Royale Militaire. This was an elite military academy in Paris, the capital of France. It's a vast complex of buildings, all of them grand and opulent from the exterior, which house the various teaching facilities of this military academy. It was founded by King Louis XV for the military education of gentlemen, of the privileged classes, but with exceptions made for intellectually gifted students such as Napoleon. Nowadays, it's still a place of learning and houses the Institute of High Studies of National Defense and the Cross-Service Defense College. Napoleon was scheduled to spend 2 years studying at the École Royale Militaire, but such was his tenacity and dedication, the 2-year course only took him half the time. In 12 months, he was ready for a military assignment and eager to begin active duties. He was commissioned as a 2nd Lieutenant of Artillery, a mere 5 months after his 16th birthday. However, France was not in a healthy state, and in 1789, civil unrest escalated into the beginnings of the bloody French Revolution. The monarchy was overthrown by the middle and lower classes, aggrieved at working conditions, taxes, and the rigid structure of domination that never changed. And the Ancien Regime, meaning old rule or old order, was swept away for good. The Ancien Regime had relied on 3 pillars of society: the monarchy, King Louis XVI of France, the clergy, in this case the Roman Catholic Church, and the aristocracy, members of the nobility who were born into their positions rather than having to work for them. However, when this society was smashed, an even more dangerous way of life took its place as the allied groups of the revolution were formed. Conflict and bloodshed followed on a scale that could not have been anticipated, as the French aristocracy was decapitated en masse by the guillotine. Neighboring European powers banded together at the time of the revolution, fearful that these radical ideas and their violent consequences would seep out of France. And they established the First Coalition, as it was called, consisting of Great Britain, Spain, the Netherlands, Sardinia, Prussia, and Austria. This First Coalition set about declaring war on France and its revolutionary ideals. From the outset, Napoleon was a wholehearted supporter of the revolution, which was hardly surprising when you consider his treatment at the hands of the sons of the aristocracy during his school days. The army, like every other branch of French life, had been governed by the Ancien Regime, and by this order Napoleon would have struggled with only natural intelligence to recommend him, rather than family connections. But the revolution offered him unexpected opportunities for rapid advancement. Some would say that Napoleon's rise to prominence was meteoric. However, it can be argued that he just happened to be in the right place, at the right time, with the right political views. Interestingly, his younger brother Lucien also flourished at this time, choosing a career in politics, again making his way on his own merits, rather than through any aristocratic connections. While all this was going on, Corsica was undergoing a mini-revolution of its own, whereby a three-way struggle between Corsican nationalists, French royalists, and radical revolutionaries was tearing Corsica apart. Napoleon fought bravely for his homeland. Advancing through the ranks of the Jacobin faction, who were a group of revolutionaries who believed in a democracy that would govern the people rather than rule them, Napoleon soon became a lieutenant colonel of a regiment of like-minded volunteers. But all didn't go to plan, and Napoleon and his family were forced to flee to France in 1793 after a run-in with the nationalist leader Pasquale Paoli. While in France, Napoleon sought out fellow Corsican Antoine Christophe Salicetti, who appointed him as artillery commander of the French forces that were besieging Toulon. This fine city in southern France had a large military harbor on the Mediterranean coast, and it had risen up in revolt against the central government of France, which had been put in place after the start of the French Revolution. This period of French history was known as the Reign of Terror, when troops adopted a policy of violent repression to crush any resistance to their newly formed government. Toulon was also occupied by troops from Great Britain, one of many European monarchies who had risen up against France, fearing the revolution would spread to their countries too. Napoleon won the day by using cunning tactics and great audacity, saving many lives in the process. Instead of attacking the troops head-on with a military strike, he trained all guns and cannons into the harbor and at the British ships. Threatening total destruction of this British fleet, he forced the British troops to evacuate, and in the ensuing assault on the city recaptured Toulon, repressed the revolutionaries, and earned a promotion to brigadier general. Napoleon also became a close associate of Augustin Robespierre, younger brother of the revolutionary leader Maximilien Robespierre, and as a result was brought to the attention of the Committee of Public Safety. This committee was set up to form an executive government of France during the Reign of Terror, when the revolution was in full flow and the dissenters were being violently quelled. Robespierre, as head of this 12-man committee, ordered trials and executions left, right, and center. It has been said that the overthrown dictatorial monarchy was just replaced by another dictator in the shape of Robespierre for as long as the Reign of Terror continued. In 1794, the Jacobean Directorate was disbanded when the revolutionaries revolted against themselves and guillotined Robespierre and his committee, not happy with how their government was leading them into an even more violent period of unrest. As a result of his friendship with both of the brothers Robespierre, Napoleon himself was imprisoned for 2 weeks when the Committee for Public Safety was brutally disbanded and the National Convention was set up to take its place. Napoleon was left to serve in Paris with no major distinction or rank and had to prove himself all over again. This was achieved in a mere 12 months when he squashed an uprising against the National Convention in 1795. Royalists and counter-revolutionaries banded together to form an armed protest and marched on Paris. Napoleon was hastily given command of any forces he could muster to defend the National Convention, who were housed in the Tweelery Palace on the right bank of the River Seine. But again, we're getting ahead of ourselves. Napoleon's leadership skills and tactical brain worked overtime to repel the threat to the National Convention in double quick time. He seized artillery pieces with the aid of a young cavalry officer called Joachim Murat, who would later become his brother-in-law, and then repelled the attackers with these same weapons. This incident was dubbed the Whiff of Grapeshot, and Napoleon frequently boasted about it. The term grapeshot refers to a type of ammunition used in cannons. It was a cluster of metal slugs loaded into a canvas bag, which looked like a bunch of grapes, hence the nickname. These clusters were more effective than a simple cannonball as, when fired, they spread out from the muzzle at high velocity, much like a shotgun, but with all the power of cannon fire. The attempted invasion of the Tuileries Palace was quickly foiled, and the protection of the National Convention earned Napoleon sudden fame, wealth, and the patronage of the new rulers of France. In particular, their leading light, Paul Barras, one of an elite 5 directors who controlled the French Republic, was most impressed. Although Napoleon was very efficient as a soldier, he was hardly a great romantic hero as he began his ascent to power. Eyewitnesses describe the young Napoleon as being untidy, with lank, shoulder-length hair, rather serious in demeanor with virtually no sense of humor whatsoever. Yet fate was about to dictate that he was to become half of one of history's most famous couples, as within a few weeks of the Whiff of Grapeshot, Napoleon had met and fallen in love with Josephine de Beauharnais. She had been married to Alexandre de Beauharnais, a French political figure and general. During the Reign of Terror, Alexander and Josephine were arrested and thrown into prison. She was freed during the trial of Robespierre, but her husband was guillotined in 1794. There is much speculation that Josephine was spared the guillotine because of her social connections. It was a complex age, and Josephine was a complex character who had undoubtedly made it her business to be attractive to powerful men. It's likely that she was aware of Napoleon's progress through Paul Barras, as she was his mistress. Some of the good citizens of France suspected that Josephine, used to the life of an aristocrat, saw in the young general an opportunity to acquire security in her life and avoid the revolutionary turmoil. Others wondered if Barras had encouraged the relationship in order to put Napoleon on a leash like a performing monkey, as it were. What better way to have control over him than by encouraging Napoleon to marry his own lover and confidant, Josephine? Whatever the reasons, Napoleon and Josephine did marry, and the wedding was held on the 9th of March in 1796. It was a relatively small affair, not really befitting of the status Napoleon now held among the general public and the National Convention. And it wasn't even held in a church, but at a magistrate's office. It is customary for the bride to be late at her own wedding, but in this case it was Napoleon who upheld the tradition, arriving 2 hours after the allotted time. Perhaps this adds fuel to the burning rumor that this was a political and financial match, rather than one purely for love. The honeymoon was even cut short. It lasted merely a few days, as Napoleon had to leave for Italy, where he had been made commander of the French army. The army that Napoleon inherited when he arrived in Italy was weak and poorly supplied, lacking both food and resources. The only thing it had was oil, and plenty of it. The administrators of the army were essentially thieves and siphoned off most of the money to live the high life at the coastal towns. General Scherer, who was in charge before Napoleon took over, had little understanding of what was happening beyond the doors of his office. He was instantly dismissed when Napoleon arrived on the scene. Morale was at an all-time low, and the troops needed molding, shaping, and encouraging. Napoleon took a loan of 7 million lire, which he used to improve the potential of his fighting force. And he became well known for making motivational and patriotic speeches to rally the troops. So instead of being downhearted and ill-prepared, Napoleon devised a daring plan to take on his enemy's vastly superior forces. Effectively, Napoleon faced two enemies: the Austrian army, who were being led by General Bulow, and the Piedmontese Army. Piedmont is a region of Italy, of which the city of Turin is the capital, who were being led by General Colley. Napoleon's plan was to divide and conquer, always aiming to gain superior numbers on the battlefield, splintering the enemy forces into small fragments by moving hard and fast. Napoleon first invaded Piedmont, separating both armies, before defeating General Bulow's Austrian army outright. General Colley's army then called a halt to hostilities, electing to retreat and quit the war. On the 15th of May, Napoleon took his army onwards to Milan, gaining significant ground. The spoils of war proved lucrative, as all famous artworks, money, and deeds to property were sent to the Directorate in France. This was more than likely appeasement on Napoleon's part. as he was acting on his own initiative the majority of the time, never waiting to see what the French government wanted him to do. To ensure stability in his continued conquests, he molded republics together and formed alliances, handing out treaties like confetti. This was a significant step in his blossoming career, as it showed that Napoleon had great understanding of things other than the military. He was, without question, much more than a soldier, possessing the potential to conquer the world if he chose. One of his more famous utterances recorded him commenting that if he hadn't been born Napoleon, he would have liked to have been born Alexander the Great. Just like Julius Caesar, Alexander the Great was one of history's famous military leaders who truly understood how to rule a huge population. Unfortunately, greatness does not always go hand in hand with goodness. As well as being arguably the most successful military commander of ancient history, conquering as he did most of the known world, Alexander the Great was also one of the most tyrannical despots of all time. In Napoleon's statement, he was already intent on becoming as famous as Alexander the Great, but the fact that he chose not to see the flaws in Alexander's character did not bode well for the future. After Milan, Napoleon's troops were in the middle of another clash with the Austrian army when General Bulow's troops returned to the fray. Added to that were further Austrian troops, this time led by General Wurmser, who entered northern Italy in an attempt to break Napoleon's stranglehold by cutting off his lines of supply. But every time the Austrians attacked, Napoleon deployed his tactical know-how and beat them. And when a third Austrian army was sent in to try and reclaim some territory, Napoleon didn't falter. After beating off all the opposition, Napoleon was determined to continue to march on Vienna, proving that he could not be defeated by any amount of Austrian resistance. He crossed the Alps, the great range of mountains that stretches from Austria through Italy, Switzerland, Germany, and France, and his army was literally yards from the Austrian capital when Austria requested peace. The resulting Treaty of Campo Formio was signed on October 17, 1797, and concluded Napoleon's campaign. The treaty also marked the demise of the first coalition of European military powers, effectively leaving only Great Britain to fight it out with France. In the same year, Napoleon also assisted in a purging of the royalist uprisers in Paris, who were threatening to overthrow the Committee of Public Safety and its directors. This now meant that, although on paper Napoleon took orders from the directors, including Barras, in fact it was they who were now entirely dependent upon Napoleon to keep law and order and allow them to function as the central French government. However, perhaps even more importantly, Napoleon was the most famous celebrity of the day. He was famous, he was loved, and the people of France would listen to anything he said. This made him an unstoppable and dominant force. 1798, Napoleon suggested an expedition to Egypt to the directors of France. They were only too happy to finance it, as Napoleon had become too popular for their liking with the French citizens. Of course, Napoleon had his own reasons for wanting this expedition to take place. Firstly, he wanted to further his own reputation as a great military leader, with the loss of influence and possible unemployment looming due to the conclusion of the struggle against Austria. Secondly, he wanted an opportunity to defeat his greatest foe, the British, who used Egypt as a major trade route to India. Such was Napoleon's influence that 40,000 men were raised and outfitted in just 3 months. Along with the soldiers, he took with him a large group of scientists and engineers. The island of Malta was seized on the way to Egypt as a means to an end, it being an ideal naval base for the French in their constant war against the British. Cairo, the capital city of Egypt, was invaded and Napoleon set up a military and a scientific base. Oddly, it was the scientific side of this campaign that gained the most respect and credence. Napoleon struggled to gain control of Cairo, with the British Navy, led by Admiral Horatio Nelson's superior fleet, squashing Napoleon's hopes for total conquest after a hard-fought battle on the River Nile. But Napoleon's scientific team uncovered one of the most amazing finds in history, while the army attempted to take Cairo by force. The discovery was the Rosetta Stone. This slab of dark, flat rock over 1 meter in height held the secrets to unlocking the previously undecipherable ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics, the writings of ancient Egypt. It took a further 20 years before the Rosetta Stone fully opened modern eyes to the ancient world of yesteryear, and this was all down to a French scholar called Jean Champollion, who worked from rubbings of the stone's inscriptions, showing 2 styles of hieroglyphics and 1 of ancient Greek. Greek, being a well-known language, was therefore the key to deciphering the hieroglyphs. In 1799, the Second Coalition was formed, again uniting countries in opposition to Napoleon and France. 2 years later, in 1801, this coalition, spearheaded by the British forces of Admiral Horatio Nelson, reclaimed Cairo, and Napoleon was forced to withdraw from Egypt. The precious Rosetta Stone was handed over as spoils of war and put on show in the British Museum, where it still remains to this day. Nevertheless, in 2003, the Egyptians demanded the return of their ancient artifact as an icon of their nation's identity. In the midst of the Egyptian expedition, Napoleon had to return home to Paris on the orders of the Directory of France, who feared an invasion from the forces of the Second Coalition. Upon his return, Napoleon found a corrupt and bankrupt Directory who were hated by the French public. Napoleon challenged Paul Barras, the head of the governing body, and overthrew him and his fellow directors, appointing himself as First Consul, a role that increased in power when he had the Constitution amended in 1802, granting him the position of First Consul for life. The term consul was used because of Napoleon's love of ancient history, in particular that of Alexander the Great, and Julius Caesar and the mighty Roman Empire. In Rome, the term was used by the two most powerful magistrates in government, who were also the highest military figures, and they effectively ran the Roman Empire. The reason there were two consuls of equal authority was so that there would always be a balance in any decision, but the Senate had the power to appoint one as the sole dictator in times of crisis. The Napoleonic version of this Roman tradition consisted of 3 consuls instead of 2. When he was appointed first consul for life, this effectively made him a dictator, and the other 2 consuls were in effect redundant. Being a lover of Rome, Napoleon even allowed his interest to dominate his architectural commissions, in particular the constructing of triumphal arches to commemorate victories over opposition forces. The prime example of this is the magnificent Arc de Triomphe in Paris, which stands centrally at the western end of the Champs-Élysées. This beautifully sculpted arch stands nearly 170 feet tall and is marginally less than 160 feet wide. In 1804, Napoleon set about changing the political and social landscape of France by creating a central administration and implementing wide-ranging and radical changes to higher education, the tax system, and the law. Of course, his famous Napoleonic Code changed the way civil law was practiced in France and in every country that was occupied or allied with France, even influencing other countries outside French control to adopt some of its legal ways. It was Napoleon's intention to reform the French legal system in accordance with the principles of the French Revolution. Thus, the Napoleonic Code was based on existing French laws and also ancient Roman laws too, by divisions into personal status, property, and acquisition of property. It was also in this year that a plot to assassinate Napoleon was uncovered that would change Napoleon's position in France to a much stronger one than ever before. Attempts on Napoleon's life had been made before, but this particular assassination attempt was traced back to the House of Bourbon, the important line of European kings whose dynasties ruled France, Spain, and Italy from as early as the 16th century. The line of Bourbon kings had been broken in France during the French Revolution, when King Louis XVI was executed in 1793, quickly followed by his wife Marie Antoinette. French royalists proclaimed his son Louis XVII king without him ever acceding to the throne, but he died of tuberculosis in 1795, while still being held in captivity by the revolutionaries. This assassination plot was attributed directly to a Bourbon, one Duke Louis Antoine Henri de Bourbon Conde of Agen, who was summarily executed. The charges were in error, but Napoleon continued with the killing of this innocent young duke anyway, due to being given false information from the leader of his special body of gendarmes appointed to protect him when he became first consul. But Napoleon, ever the clever tactician, used this incident to his advantage and recreated a hereditary monarchy of France, appointing himself as emperor. This made any restoration of the House of Bourbon impossible once the Constitution of France had been changed to allow Napoleon's ancestors to succeed to the throne. Already living in the Tweelery Palace while overthrowing the Directorate, the perfectly positioned property was soon to become the imperial residence as Napoleon became emperor. The Tweelery Palace sadly was destroyed in the 19th century by extremists, and nothing exists of it today apart from the world-famous Tweelery Gardens that cover over 60 acres of ground, leading up to the truly beautiful Louvre Museum. Inside the Louvre, of course, is housed the most famous painting of all time. And if not the most famous, certainly the most well-known, that of the Mona Lisa by Leonardo da Vinci. Napoleon crowned himself emperor in December of 1804, with Pope Pius VII giving his blessing, and then crowned his wife Josephine as empress. The coronation took place in Notre Dame Cathedral, and viewing it today, you can see why Napoleon used this imposing building for his coronation. It's considered by many to be the finest example of French Gothic architecture ever, with a grand design spread over 3 levels. It was the first building to use flying buttresses in the fundamental design, a structural feature used to transmit the thrust of a wall across an intervening space, such as an aisle, chapel, or cloister, to a buttress built outside. The employment of the flying buttress means that the load-bearing walls could contain cutouts, namely windows, that would otherwise seriously weaken the walls. The amazingly beautiful north and south rose windows are perfect examples of the freedom the flying buttress system gave architects. Ludwig van Beethoven, the famous German composer who many consider to be the greatest composer of all time, dedicated his Third Symphony to Napoleon because of his belief in the republican ideals of the French Revolution. However, in 1804, when Napoleon's imperialistic ideals were coming to the fore and his ambition for world domination surfaced, making a mockery of the French Revolution and all it stood for, Beethoven renamed the symphony the Eroica. In point of fact, popular legend has it that the composer was so disgusted at Napoleon's behavior that when he crossed Napoleon's name from the title page, he broke the pen. In 1805, a year after the coronation of Napoleon, Great Britain instigated a third coalition against France, joining forces with Austria and Russia. Napoleon knew this was taking place and had already begun to amass an amazing array of soldiers from all countries under French control. This La Grande Armée, as it was called in France, would grow and grow until it became a huge fighting force of multinationals. It began with 200,000 men, gathered together at Boulogne on the French coast for a planned invasion of Great Britain across the English Channel. However, Napoleon's plans had to be hastily altered, and the Grand Army was moved across the River Rhine into southern Germany, when Russian and Austrian armies prepared to invade France as part of the Third Coalition's directives. While his ground forces secured major victories over Austria and Russia, resulting in the surrender of Austria yet again, his naval forces lost a hugely significant battle that would allow Great Britain lasting control of the seas. This was the Battle of Trafalgar. This battle consisted of 27 British ships of the Royal Navy fleet, led by the HMS Victory, successfully destroying an Allied French and Spanish fleet of 33 ships at Cape Trafalgar, just off the southwest of Spain. The naval commander of this British fleet was the equally colorful Admiral Lord Horatio Nelson, who had been a thorn in Napoleon's side for some considerable time. However, this was their last battle, as Nelson lost his life during the final stages of the Battle of Trafalgar, ensuring that this victory would secure him a place as Britain's greatest ever naval hero. 40 years after the infamous battle, a statue was erected in the center of Trafalgar Square in London, commemorating the event. Nelson's column is exactly as its title describes, being a huge Corinthian column, resting on a pedestal decorated with 4 bronze panels, cast from captured French guns, depicting Nelson's great victories at sea. A fine statue of Nelson stands on top, proudly looking across to the Palace of Westminster, better known today as the Houses of Parliament. Napoleon, although defeated on the high seas, was winning every battle he fought across land. So a 4th coalition was formed, but Napoleon soon defeated that too, when he marched through Poland to smash the advancing Russian armies before signing a treaty with Alexander I, the Russian Tsar, which divided Europe between the two of them. With most of Europe completely pacified and under French control and influence, Napoleon decided on a new and different strategy to outwit his greatest enemy, the British. Instead of actual attack, he decided that he would wage an economic war, dubbing it the Continental System, excluding Britain from trading with any countries he had power over. He assumed that by doing this, Britain's economy would suffer terribly, and without money they would be unable to pay for any more weapons, training, ships, or manpower for their armies on land or sea. Napoleon was certain that this would put a stop to Britain forming yet another coalition and declaring any more wars on mainland Europe. It was a subtle and clever plan, and Napoleon really believed that this commercial boycott of Britain by the rest of Europe would allow him to reign as emperor in peace. While his plan worked to a certain extent, causing Britain to suffer economically through the enforced embargo, Napoleon failed to realize that it would affect the French economy too. This meant that France and Britain were locked in a checkmate position, with both losing valuable sources of revenue. Of course, this plan had only been very reluctantly adopted by the many countries under Napoleon's influence. This avoidance of physical war actually led to the very thing Napoleon was trying to avoid. Portugal was the only country that disobeyed Napoleon's attempt to cripple the British economy. The Portuguese continued to trade with France's enemy, refusing to adopt his continental system outright. In 1807, Napoleon was determined to overthrow Portugal's decision by leading an invasion force through Spain, a country that was allied with France, to enforce a blockade to stop any more trading. When he asked Spain for their support, they declined the request, so Napoleon sent an invasion force into Spain as well. Napoleon was not a man to take non for an answer. In fact, non wasn't in his vocabulary. When he received word that the generals commanding his armies were not winning, he decided once again to take charge. As soon as Napoleon was in command of the invasion force, using all his tactical brilliance and scheming audacity, he soon defeated the Spanish army and then defeated the British army who had been sent to help Spain in their efforts to repel the French. But yet again, for Napoleon, the sweet smell of success was soon to turn to a bitter stench, as he used his French troops to force King Charles IV of Spain to step down from the throne, replacing him with his brother, Joseph Bonaparte. King Charles was from the House of Bourbon, needless to say, an added incentive for Napoleon to dispose of him. He also installed his brother-in-law Joachim Murat as King of Naples close by, just to ensure Spain would be dancing to his tune rather than one of their own choosing. Unfortunately, he underestimated Spain's love for their monarch, because they were incensed by King Charles IV's removal, especially to be replaced by Napoleon's brother as a mere puppet for the French dictator. The Spanish people revolted and attacked the French invaders. Napoleon needed to quell the rebellion quickly, but he became distracted. As the Spanish rose up in revolt, Austria independently decided to do the same, and they broke their peace treaty with France. Napoleon was forced to assume command of his troops on the German front to try and secure Austria before they could do any damage to Napoleon's aspirations of total European domination. While a bloody and violent war waged near Vienna, with defeat looking increasingly likely for Napoleon and his French army, the Spanish uprising spread across the entire nation and cost him more and more troops. All in all, the Spanish revolt lasted 6 years, with over 200,000 casualties for the French. This constant drain on manpower and money was dubbed the Spanish ulcer, as it kept niggling away at Napoleon and France, producing pain and discomfort, even when Napoleon was elsewhere. The Grand Army faced a Spanish uprising that was deeply motivated by patriotism and religion. Additionally, their use of guerrilla warfare made them very difficult to pin down. This was at odds with Napoleon's carefully thought out and tactical warfare, and was something that the French troops had real difficulty in dealing with. Meanwhile, the British had recovered enough of their economy to start another war with France, forming the Fifth Coalition with Portugal and Spain. In 1808, they came ashore in Portugal, led by Arthur Wellesley, better known as the Duke of Wellington. The Duke was, like Napoleon, a military hero and a respected political leader, serving as Prime Minister twice before becoming a leading figure in the House of Lords. The Austrian War continued apace with a significant assassination attempt on Napoleon's life by a knife-wielding student. The Archduke Charles commanded the Austrians. He was one of Napoleon's most successful opponents and came very close to outthinking, outmaneuvering, and outgunning Napoleon and his Grand Army. Eventually, the war with Austria was settled, but in such a way that Napoleon's domestic arrangements were completely rearranged. The Empress Josephine was the perfect society hostess in many ways, but she had been unable to give Napoleon what he craved most, a son and heir. When the opportunity arose to further ensure peace between the nations through marriage, Napoleon divorced his wife and married Archduchess Marie-Louise of Austria in 1810. This also gave him a chance of producing a son with the young, healthy Marie-Louise. Napoleon knew that he was fertile, having fathered a number of illegitimate children, some claim simply to prove the point. But in a world where marriages were political and often devoid of love, nobody could deny that Napoleon loved Josephine. He had postponed divorcing her several times, hoping against hope that she would bear him a son. He was aware that a rightful heir to secure his status as emperor was needed, should he be killed in one of the many wars he was fighting. Napoleon had hoped to entrust his succession to one of his brothers or their children, but he was quoted as saying that his family gave him no help at all, as they were insanely ambitious, ruinously extravagant, and devoid of talent. Napoleon's marriage to the Archduchess was notable because their marriage contract was copied clause for clause from the contract between King Louis XVI of France and Marie Antoinette, who had both been guillotined at the start of the French Revolution. Nearly a year after his marriage to the Archduchess, she gave birth to a son, Napoleon Francis Joseph Charles Bonaparte, on the 20th of March, 1811. And was immediately bestowed with the title King of Rome at Notre Dame in Paris. Despite the fact that he would never actually rule, he has gone down in the history books as Napoleon II of France. In the year that followed his son's birth, Napoleon became increasingly aware that his friend and ally Tsar Alexander of Russia was being forced by the Russian aristocracy to break ties with France. They considered any alliance was an insult to Russian pride, and Alexander's political and military advisors informed him that they wanted to invade the French Empire, starting with Poland. Napoleon learned of this via his vast network of spies, and so he began expanding his grand army to something close to 700,000 men. He was advised to avoid invading the heartland of Russia because of the vast expanse of ground to be covered and the fiercely freezing weather during Russian winters. Napoleon had to date never taken advice from anybody, and he wasn't about to start now, as his invasion of Russia commenced on June the 23rd, 1812. Napoleon intended to fight one decisive battle after entering Russia, as he knew that this war needed to be won as quickly as possible. Unfortunately, the Russians did nothing but retreat, forcing Napoleon to march his men onwards to Moscow. Two significant battles at Smolensk and Borodino both ended with the Russians retreating, and Napoleon's Grand Army again having to follow them. Napoleon knew that chasing the Russian army deeper into the country spelled doom and gloom for his own Grand Army. But if he turned back, he would lose face and look like a failure to the rest of Europe. So his pride affected his judgment, and he continued on with the assault on Russia. By the time he reached Moscow, hoping to secure a peace treaty with Alexander, he found the city in flames, burning on the orders of the city's military governor and commander-in-chief. The Russians were proud and preferred to see their magnificent city burn to the ground rather than be occupied by the French. Napoleon and his Grand Army stayed a total of 4 weeks in Moscow, which was hardly enough time to recuperate before Napoleon marched out of Moscow to return to France. The return from Moscow was the turning point in Napoleon's regime, marching across the barren Russian landscape in the middle of winter. Experiencing freezing conditions, a lack of supplies, and constant attacks by the Russian forces, Napoleon's once Grand Army was depleted to a mere shadow of its former self. Napoleon left Russia with less than 150,000 soldiers, after entering the country with over 700,000. With news of his reduced manpower in the failed Russian campaign, a 6th coalition was formed to wage war against France. This consisted of Great Britain, Spain, Portugal, Russia, Austria, and Sweden. The prime objective was to secure Germany's independence, with a view to the German nation becoming a part of the 6th coalition too. However, Napoleon's tactical brain and quick thinking had evidently thawed out after the frozen winter in Russia, and he quickly set about recruiting young replacement soldiers, and the army of Marie-Louise, named after his new wife, convinced him that he, Napoleon, was once again invincible. But the odds were stacking up against him as the 400,000 troops of the 6th coalition met the 200,000 troops of Napoleon's Grand Army at Leipzig in Germany for what was to be known as the Battle of the Nations. Napoleon lost the mammoth three-day battle, which was by far the biggest of any fought throughout the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon returned to Paris with the remainder of his army, and the Battle of France began. With a grand army now seeming a lot less so, totaling around 100,000 men at most, Napoleon deployed every tactic and ounce of military know-how that he possessed to win battle after battle against the Sixth Coalition to stay in the game. But even Napoleon had to face facts. Defeat was imminent, so he offered to abdicate in favor of his 3-year-old son. But understandably, the Allies wouldn't accept this, as Napoleon would still, in effect, call the shots. The Emperor of France was thereby forced to renounce all power on the 6th of April in 1814. King Louis XVIII from the House of Bourbon was restored to the French throne, to the resentment of the citizens who still held the original principles of the French Revolution dear. The Allies agreed to exile Napoleon to the island of Elba, off the Tuscan coast of Italy, awarding him the sovereignty, a revenue of 2 million francs annually, a bodyguard of 400 soldiers, and a small navy. He was also allowed to retain the title of emperor. Napoleon spent nearly a year on Elba, plotting and scheming the demise of his enemies who had exiled him, building another army of nearly 1,000 soldiers. He finally marched on Paris to reclaim what he thought was his rightful place on the throne of France. King Louis XVIII sent the 5th Regiment under the direction of one of Napoleon's marshals from the fateful Russian campaign to battle Napoleon's forces and capture him again. In an amazing act of bravado and confidence, Napoleon approached the 5th Regiment completely alone, got down from his horse and declared, "Soldiers of the 5th, you recognize me. If any man would shoot his emperor, he may do so now." And with that, he threw open his coat and stood there like a human target. With shouts of "Vive l'Empereur" from the regiment, Napoleon took command of the very regiment that had come to oppose him. He returned to Paris to raise an even more powerful army than before, storming back into power. Napoleon realized that the vast armies of the nations combined against France would take time to mobilize and move their troops against him. So he decided to go on the offensive. He planned one swift main attack that he hoped would see off the rest of Europe for good and allow him to reign over France in peace. But it wasn't to be. He may have rid himself of Lord Nelson as an adversary at the Battle of Trafalgar, but the British had another hero waiting in the wings to rid the world of Napoleon once and for all. Napoleon finally met his Waterloo in a place of that name in present-day Belgium, when the forces of Great Britain, under the command of the Duke of Wellington, the Iron Duke, won a famous victory. Ironically, most people imagine that Wellington was called the Iron Duke because of his tough military reputation, when in fact it was a nickname acquired after he installed iron shutters on the window of his London home, Apsley House. Nevertheless, the name fitted him very well, as Napoleon quickly discovered. The defeated emperor surrendered to the British and pleaded for sanctuary, but the other nations demanded his immediate execution. The British neither gave him sanctuary, nor did they execute their fiercest and most respected rival, choosing instead to make him a prisoner of war. Napoleon was locked away on the island of St. Helena, a British-ruled island in the South Atlantic, from which place he would not be able to return. Napoleon Bonaparte spent his final 6 years in captivity, dictating his memoirs to a small band of followers, never missing an opportunity to criticize his captors. He died on the 5th of May, 1821, at 52 years of age. In his will, he had requested burial on the banks of the river Seine in Paris, but this wish was not carried out until 20 years after he had died. His remains were taken back to France and entombed in the Dome Church at Les Invalides in Paris. Napoleon's body was perfectly preserved, almost as if he had died the previous day, and scientists believe this was due to high levels of arsenic present in his system. Much debate still rages about how Napoleon died, with poisoning obviously being suspected, but scientists now believe that the levels of arsenic were due to it being used in common items such as hair wax and even wallpaper. The official cause of his demise, stated on the death certificate, was stomach cancer, recorded by Napoleon's personal physician. By present-day standards, Napoleon's life was short indeed, just like that of his hero Alexander the Great, but both men achieved a great deal in a very limited time. Napoleon dominated every aspect of his age, and no detail was too small to attract his attention. This man, who was never known for his sartorial elegance, even manipulated the world of fashion. The Empire line, with a high waist and flowing skirts, was made famous by the Empress Josephine, who was encouraged by her husband to promote the French fashion industry. His simple mandate that no lady in his court was to wear the same dress twice certainly played its part, and blocking up the fireplaces at the Tweelery Palace to ensure that layers of grand, elaborate clothing were required also helped Paris to grow in status as the international capital of fashion. The men of Great Britain may have been at war with France, but that same nation's ladies were still enraptured by the latest fashions from Paris. Napoleon's military prowess was indeed well documented, but his sharp mind was applied, as this example proves, to other areas with equal ambition and determination. The facts of history only tell half the story of this great, although on occasion not so good man, because public perception of Napoleon has played a huge part in his iconic standing down through the ages. However, controlling to the last, Napoleon did attempt to direct the writings of the historians who would tell his story, informing them of the following in his journal compiled in captivity on St. Helena. I have no fear whatever about my fame. Posterity will do me justice. The truth will be known. From nothing, I raised myself to be the most powerful monarch in the world. The historian of the empire will have an easy task, for the facts speak for themselves. They shine like the sun. On what point could I be assailed on which a historian could not defend me? For my intentions? As to these, I can be absolved. For my despotism, but it can be demonstrated that dictatorship was absolutely necessary. A worrying point of view, made even more so because Napoleon truly believed this. Fortunately, for the sake of posterity, historians have a way of running their own course, and even Napoleon couldn't continue to manipulate from beyond the grave, no matter how hard he tried. Napoleon was indeed a product of the age in which he lived, and the French Revolution gave him opportunities beyond even his own naturally high expectations. The great British writer Charles Dickens enigmatically opens his novel A Tale of Two Cities, set against the backdrop of the French Revolution, with the lines, "It was the best of times, it was the worst of times." Paradoxical as this is, it sums up the era perfectly, and the thought can be applied with equal accuracy to Napoleon, as he could be the best of men and the worst of men, all in the space of a heartbeat. It's up to each of us to go with our own instincts in forming an opinion about Napoleon Bonaparte, because the simple truth is, love him or hate him, he can never be ignored. This may not be quite the epitaph that Napoleon craved for himself, but all things considered, and on closer scrutiny, it may be as good as he deserved.